Nobody knows even why some houses are called haunted.
What would you call this place?
A deranged house isn't a bad way of putting it. Such houses are described in the Bible as leprous. Before that, in Homer's phrase for the underworld, a house of Hades.
And you really believe that this was possible? That apes were systematically taken from this planet to another and altered by selective breeding, atomic surgery, methods we can't guess, and returned with new faculties instilled in them by intelligence, perhaps something else.
Hello and welcome to the Paranormal UK radio show. I'm your host Andy Mercer, and tonight I'm actually flying solo. Unfortunately, Kerry's come down with a rather heavy cold, so he's not going to be able to make it onto the show tonight. So it's just me, but not just me talking to myself on my own. It would be rather boring if I was doing that. We do in fact have a guest tonight. His name is Jack Roth, and he is, among other things, an author of a new book that's just been published called Killing Kennedy, which is about the JFK assassination. Now, we're recording the show this evening, which is the 23rd. It's the day after the actual anniversary. The show goes out at the end of the month, but I thought we'd just mention we are recording pretty much as close to the anniversary as you possibly could do. But if perhaps, Jack, you don't mind just telling us a bit about yourself before we start?
Sure. I am an author and filmmaker, and I am here in the States, in the United States. I currently live in Orlando, Florida, and I've been doing this kind of thing for quite a while. The idea for this book actually started to come together about 3 years ago. And there's a little bit of a story behind that, but it's a good one. But I didn't know exactly what you wanted me to kind of chat about. So I actually have a friend in England, and we were talking on the phone, and we were talking about, I told him, I said, I really would love to write a book about the JFK assassination because I was always interested in it. And he asked me a really interesting question. He said, what book could you write that would be different than the 1,000 books that have already been written about it? What can you do that's different? And it was a great question, because I was like, yeah, I agree. You know, I'm not going to, there's been people doing dedicated 20, 30, 40, 50 years of their lives to researching the JFK assassination. And so we started tossing around kind of concepts and phrases such as why it still matters, ripple effects, a people's history, present day relevance, that kept coming up over and over again. So this clear theme was evolving around the idea of the ripple effects of the assassination still being felt today, and you know why it still matters 59 years later. So that was how and then I just started reaching out. I thought I would start talking to people, interviewing people in basically various disciplines, and people who may have been known someone who was involved, or researchers or academics, etc. And then the book started taking form.
Excellent. So let's rewind a little bit. Let's pretend some of our audience don't know all about the JFK assassination, which would surprise you if they didn't. But what's the background? I mean, first of all, what kind of president was JFK?
Well, there's a lot of debate on that here. And this is an interesting, I'm real excited about our conversation, because I think there might be different perspectives depending on what country you're from. I know for a fact that in Europe, when the assassination occurred, people kind of automatically knew that there was something not right, and that there was a conspiracy. That would just, they say something's rotten in the state of Denmark, right? And I think Americans were way more naive, especially back then. And but I believe Kennedy was different. He wasn't establishment. I mean, his family had money. You know, his father was a fairly powerful guy, but he was the first Catholic president. Mm. And that, of course, was a big deal here. And he was young and handsome, and his wife was beautiful. And, it was this whole thing of the new, ushering in a new age, a new era of the way things were done. But the old school obviously didn't like that very much. But I think Kennedy was a very courageous president because I think he walked into a viper's den when he came into office, because the Cold War was at its zenith, if you will. And he was dealing with a lot of people who would have loved nothing more than to go to war with Russia, nuclear war, first strike, take out, completely annihilate Cuba. They were war hawks and they were very aggressive in that regard. So Kennedy wanted to change things a little bit, and I think he probably wanted to change too much.
I remember reading various things that were occurring around the time, things he wanted to do with things like change the way the banking system worked, to end the Federal Reserve, the control of that, to bring that back more into sort of presidential control. I know there were lots of changes he was trying to implement that were very much, as you said, they were much against the establishment. And I think, as you said, the idea of war and the possibility of trying to prevent war was more what he wanted to do. And that, of course, war means money, as we all know. It costs billions to fund a war. So if you're not getting that money in, then of course it's not going to happen. So what do you think was the kind of the lead up? I mean, we're heading towards obviously the question of who do you think did it. Well, let's not get there just yet. I mean, what do you think was the lead up reasoning behind the fact that it was going to happen? Because as you rightly say, here in Europe, I'm not young enough to have been around at the events, but not that long afterwards. The idea that there was some kind of conspiracy going on, the idea that one person on their own could fire those kind of shots, it seemed to me, when I first heard about the assassination, quite crazy. So I think you're right. There was probably more skepticism over here in Europe as to what actually happened. I know that declassified files in Russia, when that was free and friendly, which it isn't at the moment, but when it was for a while, those records said that from the beginning they thought there was some kind of conspiracy that was involved in a domestic plot, not that they were involved or Cuba were involved. But I know certainly there were lots of different theories running around at the time. But what do you think was the real kind of build-up, the real catalyst?
I think what happened was, so he came into office in early 1961, and you had, so then you had all of these things happen, Cold War related, while he was in office, and the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it became clear to the people around him that he wanted détente with the Soviet Union. He didn't want to risk nuclear war. I think he realized the folly of it all. And he said as much in his speeches, especially in 1963, leading up to the assassination. He talked about the fact that we're a human race, and et cetera. And he was working behind the scenes with Khrushchev to disarm nuclear missiles. And this did not sit well with the establishment. And when I say the establishment, it was the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, the U.S. intelligence community back in the 50s and 60s was incredibly powerful. But more than that, there was no accountability. They could do whatever they wanted to do. They were orchestrating coups around the world, Guatemala and other places, in Vietnam, and doing whatever they wanted to do without any oversight. So in a way, they had a lot more power than the president did. But anyway, he was doing these things, and then he signed shortly before he was assassinated. He signed a memorandum saying he wanted all troops out of Vietnam by the end of 1964. We didn't have that many troops in at that time. It wasn't until after he died that Lyndon Johnson started pouring in thousands, tens of thousands, and then hundreds of thousands of troops. So along the way, it became clear, and he wanted to, like you said, the Federal Reserve. There were all of these things that he wanted to do, and I believe he wasn't going to play ball with the Joint Chiefs or the CIA, and he was kind of like a for the people president before he was just going to, acquiesce to these, old men who were dictating policy. And I think at some point, and he fired Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, after the Bay of Pigs, because Dulles lied to him. Allen Dulles was a very powerful man, and I think it was maybe a behind closed doors meeting or two where people very, very powerful people got together and said he needs to go. And because I really believe they thought he was going to win, he was very popular president, so he probably would have won election again in 1964. And then if that happened, that could have gone right into Bobby Kennedy winning in 68 and 72.
Yeah.
So that would have been 16 years of Kennedys.
Well, I have to confess, I have seen the movie JFK more times than I care to remember. And I know it's National Security Action Memorandum 263 that was the scaling down of the troops, and then 273 was signed by Johnson just days after the assassination. So I know a lot about this story as well.
Yes, and I love it. I love it. I've seen JFK a ton of times. That was one of the things that really motivated me. I saw that movie. It was in 1991, and it opened my eyes to a lot of things.
Well, I'll tell you a little quick story that's absolutely true. I missed it at the cinema. I didn't see it there. But I was seeing a girl at the time, and she knows an interest in history. I've got modern history and subjects at school. And she said, have you seen JFK, the film? She said, no, I've never seen it. So she got the video out. It was back in the days of video recorders. 3 hours long, watched the whole thing, rewound it, and watched it all again. I was like, bloody hell. It really was quite taken aback. I'd heard some of the story before, but didn't really know a lot about it. But I was just blown away by what I saw. If I watch it now, I can sit here and narrate the film as it goes on. Word
yes.
word. It's sad, I know. That's how fascinated I am.
Well, it was a phenomenally made film, and people they ripped Oliver Stone. Of course, the mainstream media here, that's a whole other story, but especially back then, they were the U.S. intelligence community, the agencies, they controlled the mainstream media. And it was called Operation Mockingbird. Operation Mockingbird was the official CIA program to get control of the mainstream media by putting CIA assets into all, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC, CBS, ABC. And so they kind of controlled the narrative, and they needed that. They needed to do that in order for the assassination to work, in order for the cover-up to work.
Yes. That's kind of been my reading of things. It may have been a fairly small number of people involved in the conspiracy and planning of the assassination, but lots of people got sort of dragged into it. I think from what I've read myself is they were told various versions of stories that might have been true, that perhaps there was some kind of foreign conspiracy, but we had to keep that quiet because it could cause war, all that kind of tactic was being used to draw people into, okay, well, I'll help you kind of deal with this because of the dangers of what might have gone on, without necessarily realizing who was really truly behind it. Let me just pause for a second, Jack. I don't seem to be recording, but I've got that you're recording. Is that, you got that?
I am recording, yes.
Excellent. So I need to send it to you. For some reason, it's not showing me as recording, so I may have to get you to send that over to me when we finish. But so make a note.
Okay.
So I'll just make a note of the time, and I can edit that conversation bit out. But yeah, so that was the kind of thing that struck me, was that there had to be, I mean, I'll tell the story because you're here to tell the story, of course, but there had to be some kind of government involvement because of the way things were changed around, that nobody outside of government could have done. Little bits and pieces that to me always stand out, like the idea of the Secret Service augmentation that was normally in place for a presidential visit was withdrawn. The guy, it was the 112th, I think it was, in Texas, were told that he wasn't going to be needed, which he protested against that. So this is just not how we do things. We always augment the Secret Service because there's not enough. Somebody had to have phoned within government to get him to stand down, to not provide the extra troops. Those sort of things really struck me as being, well, hey, this has to be internal government. It can't be some like the mafia or something like that. It's got to be something else like that.
That's a great point, because people ask me, well, couldn't it have just been the mafia? They hated Kennedys, right? They hated both of them. And I was like, well, the mafia may have been able to pull off a hit, but they never would have been able to pull off that kind of a cover-up.
Yeah, that's what always struck me. Other things like the fact that I know from L. Fletcher Prouty said that CIA said that those windows should have been closed. They should have been open. If the augmentation to the Secret Service had been in place, people went up to those windows, got them closed above, I think it's the second floor, third floor. So the window that Oswald, the supposed shooter, was firing for shouldn't even been open, much as someone had a rifle pointing out the window. That always struck as ridiculous. It's like there were people up on the sixth floor minutes before the assassination who saw nobody up there, and yet the parade was running about 15 minutes late. So if there was a real assassin, they would have been up there already. sitting waiting. And I'm quoting from the film, obviously, because that's what I know it from. But those points
Right.
really struck me as being, well, yeah, this so much evidence saying that this can't be the case. That it's one man alone acting.
No, there's no way. I was fortunate enough this past weekend. I was in Dallas for the JFK Assassination Conference, and I was speaking because the book just came out. So I had the privilege of going there and speaking at the conference. And one of the I did a 3-hour tour of Dealey Plaza, and it was the first time I was there. And I have to say, someone had told me once. They said, you know, if you ever really want to understand the Kennedy assassination, you have to go to Dealey Plaza. You have to see what it's like at the layout of Dealey Plaza. And it's true because, first of all, it's smaller than you think it is, right? You've seen a million times in movies like JFK and documentaries and, you know, newscasts and all that. So you see it. But when you're there, you realize not only how small it is, but you realize the guy who was leading our tour was he was a marksman in the military. So you can only imagine the insight he had. He said, well, listen, these guys, they had spotters. You know, they had spotters. There was a kill zone, and they wanted to get that triangulation of fire, and this was the perfect place for it. And the fact, you're right, the fact that windows were open, windows would never have been open. And that wasn't the only window that was open. There were several windows open. So when you're there, you realize, my gosh, you know, the minute Kennedy turned down from Main Street onto Houston, made a right onto Houston, he was a dead man. I mean, that's when you realize that there was a triangulation of fire. They waited until they made the left turn on Elm, and there's a slope, a downward slope from there, and that was the kill zone. And you see it, you can see it, and you know, you see where the 6th floor of the depository is, that window. You see where the grassy knoll and the picket fence where that was. And when you go over there, we went up to the 6th floor, and that would have been a very difficult shot. And it would have been a much easier shot for one guy, if it was just one guy coming down Houston.
Yes.
Because it was a direct shot. They were moving right towards him. But no, whoever was up there waited until that left turn was made onto Elm Street. And once they were on Elm Street, then they were in triangulation, and they were in what he called the kill zone. And so you had probably teams, 3 or 4 teams with an actual shooter and the spotter. And then you had there were people along there was a man with an umbrella, and I don't know, I think people might be familiar with it, called the Umbrella Man, and he was all of a sudden pumping his umbrella, and there were signals, and I think the signal was he was in zone 1, zone 2, shoot, don't shoot. It was so well coordinated, and this guy being in the military was like, this is modus operandi of the military, of a hit.
Yeah.
Not a hit, but like, you know, the way that would be, okay, these are kill zones. This is the way, because he talked about there were up to 7 factors that every shooter had to go through and calculate in his head within 30 seconds of taking the shot. And that included, you know, wind, humidity, slope, movement, all that. And, you know, as you know, the motorcade was moving. So, and there was a downward slope. And it was windy. So like there were all these factors, and it's just no way that Oswald could have done the shooting with the gun, especially with the gun he had, with the rifle he had, which is a really bad gun, really horrible. And his scope was defective. His scope was offline. So it would have been almost impossible for him to make any kind of shot. But it's also obvious that, you know, you see the shot came from the front. You know, and the side, and that's it's. I didn't write the book to solve the murder by any means. I wrote it so that people could understand, bring new light to the fact that regardless of who killed Kennedy and why, it's our responsibility as citizens living in a free society to call out and hold responsible all the conspirators. and I wanted people to get a better feel for that, and by interviewing the people that I interviewed. And so yeah, it's amazing. If you have you ever been to Dealey Plaza?
I haven't. I am hoping that possibly we'll be able to go next year for the actual 60th anniversary. There's a possibility we might be able to make it out for that, but I haven't yet. But would certainly definitely would like to, because you do feel that you can only get so much of what a place looks like from even 3D modeling, that kind of thing I've seen done, but you don't really get a sense to, as you say, until you're actually there. But that's one of the things that struck me, of course, is the route itself didn't make any sense. I know that the newspaper the night before published it could go down Main Street, and this Elm Street turn was again against regulations and seemed to have been changed at the last minute, which again, who had the power to make that change? It always strikes me as strange. But as you say, obvious shot from some of the sixth floor is straight down Main Street, because it's coming towards you. They can veer away, but you can still get them, and you've got all the time in the world for that first shot to line it up perfectly. And yet, from memory, the first shot probably missed completely, the one that had the longest time to set up. So again, it doesn't make sense to be one person firing. So who did you find most interesting when you were talking to? You say you've interviewed a few people. Obviously, I've not got the book yet. I will get it, but I haven't had a chance yet. Who were the most interesting people you spoke to?
I think everyone in their own way was really interesting. And what struck me the most is that the level of emotion in the interviews. And I think that speaks to how important and why the assassination still matters, because people still have visceral reactions to it, especially in the United States. And again, all really interesting people that brought a lot to the table, and I think provided fascinating new insight. But there were a couple people I interviewed. I interviewed the son of E. Howard Hunt, and E. Howard Hunt of Watergate infamy, and CIA operative, and someone who was not only involved in Watergate, but was also involved in the Kennedy assassination. And in fact, a lot of the burglars from the Watergate break-in, some of those guys were seen in Dallas 10 years earlier in Dealey Plaza. So it was these same CIA operative kind of guys, assets to the intelligence agencies. And he just talked about what it was being the son of a CIA operative, someone who was in the CIA, and the collateral damage it causes to a family because they're up to so much nefarious stuff. All these guys were really heavy drinkers, because back in the day, that's what you did, right? You drank, and if you wanted to forget about stuff and you wanted to just, drown away your worries, you drank. People drank a lot, and it seems like I interviewed 4 individuals whose fathers were in the CIA during that time period, and it was always the same kind of story of the dysfunction as far as the family is concerned, and that kind of thing, and the things that the family members, the wives and the children, kind of had to endure. But that was I felt very interesting. But I also interviewed a woman by the name of Judith Very Baker, who was with Oswald in New Orleans during the summer of '63, leading up to the assassination, and they had an affair in New Orleans. And that was an absolutely one of the most fascinating interviews I've ever done in my life. In my mind, there's no reason whatsoever to not believe this woman. She's very credible. She's very smart. She was doing cancer research in high school. She was brilliant girl. And then she was doing an internship in New Orleans and met Oswald. And then she met all these people because Oswald knew Jack Ruby. She met Jack Ruby in New Orleans. Obviously, David Ferry was another character there in New Orleans. There was a lot going on in New Orleans, especially with the Cuban exiles. And it was also a hub of U.S. intelligence community back in the early '60s and the '50s. New Orleans was almost a center of U.S. intelligence because of its location and proximity to Central and South America. So and that was an incredibly emotional interview. And for example, I'll give you one example of that. Oswald, of course, was sent then to Dallas. So he was in New Orleans, and he was sent to Dallas. And I believe The reason for that is Oswald was a U.S. intelligence operative.
Mhm.
He was an asset. He was involved in the false defector program. That's why he quote unquote defected to the Soviet Union, and he was able to come back with a Russian wife and child without hardly an interview at all. Like, you would think if you defected to Russia, you would be very difficult to get back into the United States. And he got in without a problem. In fact, they gave him money and they set him up. And so there's no question. And that's coming out now, and even in documents, that Oswald was an intelligence asset. So when they told, and it was a lower level asset. So when they told him, he was doing what he was doing in New Orleans. Then he goes down to Dallas. And at some point down in Dallas, he realizes what's going on. He realizes that there's going to be an attempt on Kennedy's life. And that's the whole story of when he went to the offices of the Dallas FBI, the FBI offices in Dallas, and handed them a note, slipped them a note saying there's going to be an attempt on Kennedy's life. Now, of course, they ignored it, the FBI. But Oswald was really trying to prevent it. And said Oswald thought he was part of an abort team that was trying to prevent the assassination. And about 37 hours before the assassination, he called Judith, and Judith, Judith at the time had left New Orleans, so she was in Gainesville, Florida. So they were talked on the phone, and Oswald said, "I don't know if I'm going to be able to get out of this one. I don't know if I'm going to survive this," because I think he realized what was happening. And Judith told him, "Let's just go to Mexico. I'll meet you in Mexico." And Oswald was like, "I can't do that. If I do that, they're going to kill Marina. They're going to kill the girls." He had two very young girls with Marina, and he had a family. He loved his kids. He didn't necessarily love Marina at that point, but he loved his kids. And he told Judith, I can't leave. There's no way." And this is what he told her, according to Judith. He said, he said, "If I stay, there'll be one less gun pointed at Kennedy." So that tells me that he was staying, and he was maybe going to try to prevent it. He certainly wasn't going to be pointing any guns. And there are a lot of people that believe he didn't touch a gun that day.
Yes, no, it makes perfect sense. I mean, the test they did on the body showed there was no contact with any powder residue from anything being fired until after he was dead. A week later, suddenly a handprint gets found. That is just higher suspicion. It's ridiculous.
Highly. I mean, there's so many. You know what? In the book, I talk a lot about critical thinking, and I talk a lot about the fact that there are so many things. Like if you're a critical thinker, if you're an objective thinker, you can't count how many instances there are where you're like, okay, there's definitely a conspiracy. There's no way. I mean, there's just too much.
Yeah.
And I tell people, I mean, listen, the minute Jack Ruby kills Oswald, that's it. There's your conspiracy.
Yeah, the reasons he gave are just nonsense, weren't they?
Nonsense.
The trial. It's like
ridiculous. But here's where it gets really interesting, Andy, and this is the point that I try to make in the book. That's why I interview some psychologists, because why? In Europe at the time, they're like, oh yeah, there was a conspiracy. He was killed by the guy. He was, there were other people involved in this, and in the United States, they bought the lie for the most part, especially at first, and I asked why that would happen, and I asked a psychologist, and she said it's something called cognitive dissonance.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. The whole idea of cognitive dissonance, where it's so uncomfortable to believe, to admit that your government would do something like that, that it's easier to believe a lie.
I remember reading many years ago, Mark Lane, when he first started giving talks about the assassination, he'd be going into like lecture theatres, and people were saying to him, how can you doubt what the Attorney General has said? How can you possibly say, well, Warren's wrong, that he's involved or this? How can you say that? And it's like today you think, well, yeah, of course. But just the idea of questioning that level of authority in those times was just beyond beyond possibility. I should mention I'm a psychotherapist by trade, so I know a bit about this kind of the cognitive dissonance and the idea of your own internal bias towards certain ideas. And I know sometimes people do talk about conspiracy theorists as being cognitively biased towards believing certain things to fit their narrative. But, you know, with this, the evidence is there. You just pull the stuff together. If you pull all the evidence together, you cannot say that one person did this. It's impossible. And as we're both saying here, you can't say it's just a group outside of the government responsible, because there's too many things that happened that only the government could actually influence, make happen.
Right.
And that, to me, is the most fascinating thing, that they're trying to weave this narrative to make it seem possible. Like, I mean, we've got to talk about the magic bullet theory, of course, because that's one of the most ridiculous elements of the whole thing. Do you want to tell the story of the magic bullet?
Well, yeah, I mean, basically you have Arlen Specter, who's a government shill, always was a government shill. I never liked that guy. When he became senator in Pennsylvania, I just disliked him. You know how there's a gut feeling about people? and my intuition was screaming at me like, yeah, this guy's no good. I mean, he is just a horrible human being. And so he comes up with this ridiculous theory. And that came down to the fact that they couldn't account for the amount of bullets, so they had to make in order to make it so that Oswald was the only shooter and the shots were all from behind. They had to come up with this magic bullet theory. It's actually called a single bullet theory. That then I think it was either Mark Lane or someone else called the magic bullet theory, and because it was so absurd. You want to talk about critical thinking? If you're if you have 1 ounce of critical thinking skills in your body, you're going to know immediately how ridiculous this theory was. And Arlen Specter came up with it. So he's like, well, he was this young attorney, and it was all about power. He wanted to get ahead.
Yeah, of course.
You know.
Yeah.
So he's like, oh, it hit Kennedy, and they changed the location. They had to change the location of where he was shot in the back, because you had the shot that doctors believed when it first happened, when he was taken to the hospital, that the bullet wound in his throat came from the front. It was an entry wound in the front of his throat. Absolutely. So then they did a tracheotomy because they were trying to keep him alive, and they were putting a tube down there, so they had to make it a little wider and they had to make it a little bigger. So that's why there's confusion in that. But all the doctors, they knew it was an entry wound. Yeah. So now you have to and then there's the shot to the head. So they have 1 more bullet to play with, right? Because Oswald could only get 3 shots off, if that, right? So this bullet goes in the back of Kennedy, goes through him, hits Connolly in the wrist, takes a left-hand turn, goes through, hits him in the thigh, and lodges in his thigh. Then all of a sudden shows up on a gurney in the hospital the next day, pristine. Not just a pristine bullet, as if it was not even fired.
There's 2 bits I just want to mention, because these are the ones that I felt the craziest. There's 1.6 seconds between Kennedy being the bullet leaving him and hitting Connolly. It was floating in midair for 1.6 seconds and changed direction. That's
it stopped. That's it. Right. It stopped, made a left, made a right.
Exactly.
Hit him here. Hit dense bone. Right. Yeah. First of all, went through Kennedy's body in the back. Hit all this kind of bone and body stuff, and they tested this on bullets just going through 1 bone, and the bullet is unrecognizable.
And I know neuron activation tests showed there was more fragments in Connolly's wrist than had been lost by the bullet, which is impossible.
It doesn't work.
No, exactly.
So, but they didn't talk. Here's the key: is the media. They had to control the narrative. They had to control the narrative, period. Because they knew people would find out or think or, investigate this and try to find out. So, but the media never covered any of that. The media only took the side of the Warren Commission and, these great men on the Warren Commission. Guess who was on the Warren Commission? Alan Dulles, the guy that Kennedy fired. And probably was one of the masterminds. Him and James Angleton from the CIA were probably the ones from the CIA who were behind this. So, and I'm not saying for sure. I wasn't there. Listen, people ask me, and I say I'm not going to say for sure who did it. I have my theories, but I wasn't there. I wasn't on the grassy knoll that day. I wasn't on the 6 book the sixth floor of the book depository, and there's no way I'll ever know for sure. But based on really looking at this objectively and looking at the evidence objectively and looking at all of it,
yeah,
starting with Jack Ruby, starting with what happened immediately after, starting with why was Oswald at a movie theater, and then all of a sudden 200 cops show up at the movie theater. How'd they know he was at the movie theater?
And one did shout, "Murder the president," on those lines, didn't they? They actually shouted that. Right. Where did that idea come from? They're looking for a guy who shot a cop. That was it at that particular point. Right. And that's when that line said. But no one's ever admitted who said it. But I know people in the audience, as well as those involved, heard it being said and shouted it. "Murder the president," will you? Something along those lines. So it was definitely said by somebody in that the movie theater. But who?
Yeah, it was. I think Oswald was going there to meet his CIA handler.
Oh, absolutely,
because
totally agree.
Right, because he was probably terrified. He's like, "Hey, what's going on here?" He was a smart guy, Oswald, very smart, and he was probably like, "Oh my God, am I being set up here? Oh my God!" Right? So he goes, and then he probably most likely called his handler, and the handler said, "Oh, I just show up at the movie theater. I'll meet you there."
Yeah.
And a lot of people believe he was supposed to be killed there, but he wasn't killed there, which is why they had to get Ruby involved.
I also remember there was a series that was shown over here in the 1988 anniversary, The Men That Killed Kennedy. Now, the first 5 parts were made by one TV company, and the subsequent episodes have been added to it later on, were made by a different company, and it goes in a different direction. But the first 5 episodes were made here, and they're very good. And they interview one of the guys who was basically looking after him in the prison cell, Ruby in the prison cell. And Ruby was sweating and panicking, and was in a really bad state until he was told that Oswald was dead. And apparently he calmed down at that point and was more relaxed, because I think he thought he was probably going to get off of it because he was the national hero killing the man that killed Kennedy. But the reaction was bizarre. It's like, well, the guy's dead. Oh, because that could be the death penalty, of course. But Ruby was apparently more relaxed after he heard Oswald was dead, which is quite bizarre.
It's incredible. Do you know that The Men Who Killed Kennedy, which is, by the way, an absolutely phenomenal series, it was banned here for the longest time. It's very hard to see here. Like, you have to maybe on YouTube, and now with social media, it's hard to completely ban it. Yeah. But they did not, because I know Lyndon Johnson's family sued, and then the guy who directed that, didn't he become a recluse? I don't know if you would know more about him in England, but the guy who made that,
I'm not sure. I know that, as I say, there was certain problems with because the first 5 parts were made, and then these subsequent ones were made afterwards, and I think they're the ones that caused all the problems, because it was a different company who kind of carried it further, because the first was the 5-part one. I'll look into that, actually, because I don't know. I've watched the 5-part version. I used to have it on videotape when it first came out, and I've got it on DVD now. And as you said, it's actually on YouTube as well. You can actually find it, and it is brilliantly put together. And I know that Oliver Stone saw that, as well as used some of the information that was the basis of the movie as well. But yeah, I don't know much detail about that. I'll look into that, though, because that's interesting. But yeah, the kind of pressure that gets involved, because you are exposing very powerful people who really want this to go away. And you forget about it. Let's pretend it didn't happen. Let's just move on as if there was no secret murder, as it were, at the heart of the establishment, which is basically what it was, of course.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that, I believe that what's happened in this country is, I think in 1963 we're at the height of our what at the time was called American exceptionalism. Right after World War II, the 1950s, the early 1960s, it was like we were at the top of the world. We were the best. And there was actually a thing called American exceptionalism. The minute Kennedy was killed, from that moment on, American exceptionalism started to erode. And look at what's happened since. I mean, and I'm talking about immediately after he was killed. You got the Vietnam War, right? The escalation of the Vietnam War. You have these wahoos as presidents, right? Lyndon Johnson, who was the biggest piece of work maybe ever to live, and had, you want to talk about a egomaniacal, sociopath, elitist. I mean, you go on and on with this guy. I interviewed a guy who did a lot of research, wrote a couple books on Johnson, and that guy was a piece of work. And I don't think Johnson was involved in the actual assassination, but he was very willing to help cover it up.
I remember again, so I read years ago about the conversation between Johnson and Hoover, and Johnson said, Hoover, were there any of the shots aimed at me? So he wasn't involved in the conspiracy, but certainly knew something was going on afterwards from the sounds of, again, from what I've read. I mean, I've read quite a few books on the topic.
He was just worried. He was worried about himself. That's the kind of guy he was. It's like, you didn't aim any of those shots at me, did you? You know, like he was just worried about his own butt. Yeah. You know, that's the way he was. I mean, he was just, yeah, you're talking about a lot of very horrible men, but you know this. Listen, I think the lesson in all this is that governments are very corrupt. I mean, you can't, power and corruption go hand in hand.
Yeah, so very much the case. It is often the longer someone's in power, the worse it gets as well. And it was, as you say, it was more of an establishment in power over those years. The president also became less important unless he was. I mean, Johnson was ideal because, of course, he'd go along with what they wanted anyway. So they knew enough to get rid of him because he was going to do what they wanted. So it was the Kennedys were the problem because they were the outsiders. They were the ones who were trying to change things. They actually believed he was president, as in run the country, not just a part of a bigger picture. So that's right. Has always been that reasoning behind, because people sometimes say, well, why did they want to kill the guy? He was so popular. Well, there's the answer. He was so popular. They didn't, as you said yourself, they didn't think he would he'd probably win the next election by a landslide in '64. So the only way to get him out of the picture was by this method. So I'm going to pin you down. Who would you say was ultimately responsible? Would you be able to point a particular direction, or you're not so sure? Not sure what to say.
No. I say in the book, and I can stand by this. I'll stand by this for sure. This is 100% sure about this. That the Cold War killed Kennedy. And what I mean, and the Cold War and its Cold Warriors killed Kennedy. And it was the times in which Kennedy governed that got him killed. He walked into this hornet's nest in 1961, and there was so much going on at that time. The CIA was totally out of control. I mean, totally out of control. There was no oversight whatsoever. They could do whatever they wanted and get away with it. They were doing assassinations all over the world. And that just to their own ends. And that was way beyond their mandate, because the CIA is supposed to be an intelligence gathering organization. Just their job was to gather intelligence around the world. That's it. And they obviously did a lot more than that. So, and this all came out in the 70s about the CIA. They had several commissions look into it, and it was just really, they were well beyond their scope of duties and responsibilities. So they were out of control. You had a Joint Chiefs of Staff that were ready to annihilate the Soviet Union and thought we could, because we had better first strike abilities, that we could, if we lost 10 million people, what the heck, whatever, collateral damage. They didn't care. These people did not care. And they were the type of people who, I don't know if they really valued human life very much at all. So Kennedy came into this, and he's like, well, and I think the Cuban Missile Crisis really scared Kennedy. And Kennedy realized that this could not go on like this. I mean, we came very close to nuclear war. Yeah. And he realized that this was absurd, and that, he had children, and, people, no one wanted this. So he went ahead, and I think he also believed that as president, he had the most power, and especially with Bobby as Attorney General, that they had the power. And I think the lesson for every president who's been president since is, you don't have the ultimate power, and if you try to do anything like that, you're going to get it just like Kennedy did.
Yeah, I see. If you fit in with the schema, the plans, then you're no problems. But you try to move against it, they're going to try and act against you. And that, as you said, that's definitely what happened in this particular case. It is one of those ones that, as I say, it just won't go away. People try to sort of say, oh, it's history, let's move on from it. But the whole world changed direction in that moment. As I say, for America particularly, of course, the Vietnam War itself became a major war. After, 10 years? The cost of that, lives and money, it was terrible. But it wouldn't have happened. I firmly believe that it would not have happened if Kennedy had survived. And, of course, as you say, the dangers to the world with possible nuclear war. I think probably Europe, us here, were the first to get flattened completely with Russia next door. Then you guys have been hit. So it would have
Right.
had a massive effect on us as well. So it does matter to us, because the way the world works is what's going on in America tends to affect everybody else. And if it's changing direction in an unpleasant way, then we all get dragged into that. So yeah, it has ramifications for the future as well. But it is one of those cases that it's still, I'm just speaking personally, it still just blows my mind that this happened and it's just not really been resolved. The thing that strikes me, and I'm sure you notice as well, that there are two commissions on the assassination, the Warren Commission and the House Assassination Committee. Both of them have a set of findings that are different to each other, but both are still official. How do you have two official explanations? One very much lone assassin, one, yeah, okay, there's something going on. There may have been a fourth shot fired. There might have been another shooter. I know it's all kind of a bit vague, and it's all tied up with the audio recordings that were captured on the microphone of the police outrider, which seems to show sounds of more than 3 fired shots, and the possibility that there is someone firing from the front, which we know there was, obviously, because of the way the Kennedy's head moves and the damage. There's no way that's not from the front. It's physically impossible to have not been shot from the front to produce that effect. But that always struck me, the fact that there's two different reports, final findings, that contradict each other, yet they both still stand as official. It's just crazy.
It is crazy. And, one of the reasons is, well, of course, the House Select Committee was in the 70s, so it was a updated investigation, and the CIA was under fire because people were realizing just how out of control that agency was. So, but the media played it down. When the House Select Committee came out with its findings, it said there was a probable conspiracy. We feel like there probably was a conspiracy. Got very little media coverage. So, yeah, and it's just, and people ask me, well, it's 60 years going on, 59, going on 60 years. The people who did this are dead. Of course, they might have relatives, obviously, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, but they're dead, so why not come out with the truth? And what I tell them is the institutions are still alive.
Yes.
It's the institutions. It's the CIA. It's the federal government. It's the Secret Service. It's the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's these institutions that it would listen. Talk about eroding trust. If that comes out now, what's their excuse to say why all these years later? Because the CIA has been keeping this. They have information. They know. The CIA knows, but they've been keeping it from us. And people get excited about the documents being released. And I always say, what do you think they're going to give you? Do you really think there's going to be this document that says, from Alan Dulles to James Angleton, that says we need to kill Kennedy, let's make it happen? That is never going to happen. First of all, yeah, exactly, right, with a diagram and with the joint, Curtis LeMay and all these other guys involved. It's not going to happen, and that those documents simply don't exist because they never would have documented it. You might find out information about Oswald's connection to the CIA and the FBI and the naval intelligence. Those kinds of documents could still be out there somewhere as a matter of record keeping, right? If Oswald was part of this or that, and some of that has come out, but it's also spoon fed. It's like you learn a little bit as time goes by, a little more as more time goes by, but. And then all the American presidents today are supposed to release all the rest of the documents, and they don't. They keep delaying it. Why do they keep delaying it? Well, it's because the institutions, it would cause a lot of, that would cause a lot of damage to national security, because basically people would be like, are you kidding me? How do you justify this? How do you justify a 60-year lie and cover up?
Yeah, it becomes so ingrained that you just cannot release the truth. One of the other things that always strikes me as well, again, with the actual moment of events, the Warren Commission report, when it describes what it believes happened on that day, there's not a single witness on the day who has the same description of the events. Not one of them. Again, just seems bizarre. Nobody thought the same as you did. No one. The footage of people running towards the grassy knoll, they all heard shots from there. There's no escaping. They heard at least one shot from that knoll. That's why they all ran there. It's not they're not trying to run away because they're being shot at. No, they're going there because the gunman's coming from there.
Yeah, there were people that, there were some military, ex-military or current military guys who were there with their families or whatever, for whatever reason, and they know gunfire.
Yeah.
And they heard it and they're like, let's get the, bastard, excuse my language, but like, let's get, they went up there to tackle him and get him, whoever was doing that shooting. So, but they strong-armed people from the get-go. They had guys in Dealey Plaza in suits that they were, intimidating people. Well, you need to, first of all, they wanted everyone's film. They try to take everyone's film, anyone who was shooting, whether it was a film camera or a still camera, they confiscated everything that they could. And when they got people, when they quote unquote interviewed people who were there, right? They strong armed them. They're like, someone would say, well, I saw the shots come from, I heard them come and I saw a puff of smoke in the grassy knoll. No, you didn't. Oh yeah, of course I did. No, you didn't. It's like, what do you mean? What are you telling me what I saw? No, you didn't. And you will never talk about that. We got that part of it. Don't worry about it. Right, like the whole thing in the movie too, like, but that's what happened, and they just, it was all one big, and so anyone who did see anything either wound up dead, within the next 3 years, or was terrified and shut up.
It's like Lee Bowers, of course, the guy.
Lee Bowers,
at the back of the grass, where the car park. He said he saw two people and some kind of commotion and a puff of smoke. And we didn't say a gunshot, but pretty much that's what he's saying. And he saw them. Was he 2 years later? He's dead in a car crash on his own, single car crash.
Yes.
It's too much of a coincidence, isn't it?
It is. And he testified. And that's the thing about Lee Bowers. He was just an honest guy. I mean, he was just doing his job that day. And when you're in Dealey Plaza, you see the tower. It's not very far from the picket fence. So you get a feel for. He had a perfect view of everything.
Yeah.
And so he saw these cars coming in and out and these weird guys, and one guy was holding something that thought was a walkie-talkie. Yes. And then there was a guy in a police uniform with a gun, and a guy in a hard hat, and I think that was the spotter who had a walkie-talkie. And then, and then another guy saw afterwards the guy threw the gun to another guy as he walked past. The guy who got it took it and started to disassemble the gun right away. These are experts. These are pros.
Yeah.
These guys do not mess around. They know what they're doing. They're good at it. And if there's any loose ends, they take care of the loose ends. And then by controlling the narrative and by controlling the media, everything's taken care of, basically. And that's what happened. That is what has happened.
Yeah. Have you seen the Badgeman photograph?
I have.
Yeah, for me, I just tell our listeners, is a photograph was taken within 1/6 of a second of Kennedy being shot. You can see he's in the foreground. You can see the head damaged, and he's perfectly in line with the picket fence of the grassy knoll. And a couple of researchers, whose names I've skipped me for the moment, but they took the photograph and they zoomed in on the area. And it does look like there's a man, possibly in uniform, with a white flash in front of him, a man beside him with a construction helmet on, looking in a different direction, standing there. Literally at the right moment. It's literally, they've got the photograph of the actual gunman. I mean, people have debated whether the photograph's genuine or not. If you really are, it's just cognitive bias to see what you want to see there. But no, you see it colorized, and it's hard to ignore. There's something there. It's definitely going on. It's amazing. And then you've got I forget the chap's name. There was a young guy who was on leave who was actually filming not far from that point on the grassy knoll, and he always said he heard a shot go right past him, and no one ever believed him until the photograph came out. And you can see there's somebody else standing slightly to one side, possibly holding a camera in front of his face. It was like, wow, that's brilliant. So
it is brilliant, and isn't that incredible? And a lot of people believe, there was a lot of that at talk about a gentleman by the name of Roscoe White. They think that was the badge man. And I learned a little bit more about Roscoe White. So if people want to do more research, it's Roscoe White. And he was a master marksman, the highest order, one of the best shooters in the world. And he was also a killer. I mean, he killed dozens of people as a, whether, I think I think he was in the military, and then maybe he was a police officer. I'm not sure exactly. And he was transferred to Dallas Police Department like a couple months before the assassination. At any rate, the Roscoe White story is very interesting, and they think that is Roscoe White.
It's interesting, is the program we talked about before, the men that killed Kennedy, identified a Corsican mafia gunman called Lucian Sarti as being the man behind the picket fence. And what's interesting, I noticed, is the way in which the photograph has shown what would be the guy's forehead and hairline on the grass. Look at him and look at a picture of Sarti. It's almost the same. And there's a guy called Michel Nicoli, who was a Corsican mafia guy who turned basically defense, and he's been taken off in, what's it called? My brain's not well. My mouth's not working. My brain's not working today. Taken off, protective custody. He's taken off, and he's given information to Steve Ravel about the background of the assassination. He said these Corsican mafia guys were the main gunmen behind it. So it might be worth looking into that one, Lucian Sarti. So he's mentioned in the program. I've tried to get hold of Steve Ravel's book, but it's very hard to get hold of. He did get it published, but it's really hard to track down. Maybe because it's correct, maybe it's not correct. I don't know, but I'll certainly check out the guy you've mentioned as well, because that's interesting. There's different names coming up.
They could very well be the case that both of them were there. And that's what a lot of people talk about. Like, there could have been several teams, several people. Oh, yeah. A lot of people also say that there were assassins walking around Dealey Plaza that day who were told to be there but didn't do anything. And the reason for that is plausible denial. So in other words, the opposite. So it would be, well, you were there, people saw you, so they wanted to confuse matters. And I heard that, and I'm not sure if that's true or not, but there were a lot of people in Dealey Plaza that day who recognized each other because they were all involved in that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But you got your orders, so your job was to do this. You didn't know what anyone else was doing unless you were maybe part of the inner team. Yeah. But the idea that it's logistics, it's all about logistics. So these guys come in, they can come from the Corsican angle was always very interesting to me, because you bring people in from other countries and again, they could not be the people who did this, whoever they may have been that were responsible, could never be fingered for it. Yeah. So they had to, you're bringing in others. It's almost like you're freelancing it out. You're subcontracting. So you're subcontracting with the Corsican mob, who was very active in those days and had a lot of really amazing sharpshooters, right? So, or the mob, who had their own contract killers, or the military, the best Marine sharpshooters there were. Mm-hmm. And you position them wherever you position them. And then as soon as it's over, boom, you flip the gun to someone else. They take the gun. You get in a car. You go to a small airport that gets you out of Dallas, gets you to Dallas to Austin or something like that. And then from Austin, you stay there for a couple of weeks in a safe house. And then you get to Canada. And then you stay at a safe house there for a month. And then you get back to Europe.
Yeah, that's why it always made more sense for me, the idea there was someone they bought from abroad, because then it's easier for them to disappear back off to where they've come from. If they're American citizens, you can more likely to find them again. But yeah, right. We're talking about definitely three teams were involved, so certainly one of them could be the guy from the grass. The other ones, of course, are behind, and they were ones also shooting. Then they could be part of that team. What do you think of the photograph of the three so-called tramps that were pulled off the steamers, the trains that subsequently disappeared off the face of the earth until many years later, when miraculously the records were found? Of course they were. What do you think about those three guys? Because one of them has been suggested that one of them may have been E. Howard Hunt.
Yes, and it's actually not E. Howard Hunt, and it could have been this other guy, but it wasn't E. Howard Hunt. But it looks a little like E. Howard Hunt, and I find that interesting because, again, when you're in Dealey Plaza, you realize the train depot and the tracks and are right behind the picket fence. And so there were these open box cars, and these guys certainly could have been disguised as tramps, and been in that area. It makes total sense. So what's interesting about the photos is that they really don't look. The third guy looks like a hobo. The old guy that people say could be Howard Hunt, whoever. Some people think it's Chauncey Holt, who is another CIA guy. Right. Yeah. And and that could very well be the case. But he's distorting his face in every picture, and if you think about that, that would be the smart thing to do: distort your face. No one can really see your face and what you really look like. So, but the other two guys, right? But the other two guys are very calm, cool, calm, and collected. They are not dressed like hobos. They're clean. Their clothes are clean. They have cuffs. They look really good for hobos.
Yes, I know.
And that is a creepy. I've always been fascinated by those photos.
I know one of them was identified as possibly being Charles V. Harrelson and another mafia guy. I think the youngest one at the front, of course, is the father, Woody Harrelson, the actor. And he has been interviewed. Again, it was on the Men That Killed Kennedy, and he's always denied it. But at some point later on, he said, no, he was there to witness what was going on. And he is the first of the three tramps. I know when they put photographs of him at that time next to the picture itself, there was quite a lot of points of likeness in the faces. Obviously a bit distorted because he's sort of leaning down again, but the possibility that was Charles Harrison is quite real, I think.
Yeah, and again, it's fascinating. I don't know if we'll ever know for sure at this point. People ask me, will we ever really know the truth? And I say, I hate to be a bummer, but I don't think so. I really don't. I just hope people need to open their minds to the fact that this happened, and their own minds, and do work to make sure, do things as citizens to make sure that this never happens again. Yes,
absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's the funny thing, is if it would happen today, we would straight away be on the case. No, we don't believe this official story. I think that's one of the reasons why it's possibly less likely today, because those kind of things would be quickly looked at. There's too many nice conspiracy types around, too many radio shows to be on it straight away, I think. So I think it's probably less likely to happen today. They'd find other ways of pushing people out of power, whether it's through scandals or invented information, that kind of thing, false news. One thing I just want to quickly cover, what do you think about Bobby Kennedy's assassination? Do you see connections? Do you think it was a government again, or was individual, or was not? You're not really looked into it?
I find it interesting. Obviously, I find it a little coincidental, but obviously, and I think that I don't know enough about that story, that assassination, to kind of know anything for sure to really comment. I mean, I comment on it, but I don't know. Like, I feel like it makes sense that they would have gotten rid of, because Bobby in his own right started to gain a lot of momentum. He had just won the nomination, so he would probably have become president.
I think I'd read that he would definitely have looked into his brother's murder,
and he definitely would have. Yes, he said he would have, and he was waiting to have that power to do it. And they just weren't gonna. They were just killing everyone. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. I mean, you name it. Medgar Evers. I mean, they did whatever they wanted to do. There were all these people who were trying to change things that they just killed. They shot. They always had a patsy. They always had someone that there was always more to it. Yeah. But they got away with it.
I think that's it. That was the trigger. The fact they got away with killing Kennedy. They thought, well, if we can do it this time, we did it with the president. I was trying to get these other people like Martin Luther King. They're just annoying, so we get them out of the way easily. We killed the president, and after all, you can see it almost emboldens them to think, well, we can do anything now. Absolutely. Right. I think I always draw a bit of a line between that right up until Nixon and Watergate. I think that was when it kind of fell apart. The wheels fell off. He really couldn't keep. I mean, whether he was involved, what he knew about it when he was president, I don't know. But I think, as you said yourself at the start, it was the same people, the same type of people doing all these sorts of things. And obviously they saw him as a better choice for president because he would keep the war going, at least initially. And of course, he wanted to end the war. But to me, they saw him as being the right kind of person that Nixon fitted with their agenda. So they were happy to make sure that they lent their support to making sure he won the election again. And because he was a little on the paranoid side himself, he was happy to go along with it too. But I do see a line between those events, the whole chain of events there, as almost beginning with Kennedy, as we did this, we got away with it, right up to the Watergate, and then, it's kind of not worked this time because it's all kind of fallen apart and he's been found out. That's my own personal reading of the whole kind of the chain of events.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that for sure. But again, I wouldn't, in an authoritative way, I would never say for sure this or that, or I know that, especially with Bobby Kennedy. I just don't. I'm anxious. There's supposedly a couple of really good books that have just been written on the Bobby Kennedy assassination. I would be interested in reading. But Yeah, no, there's a connection. There's got to be a connection with all of it.
Well, one thing we should talk about a little bit, because we get moaned at when we do a show that's not paranormal, that we should talk about something to do with the paranormal. I notice you do your own podcast, Paranormal Unwrapped. What sort of things do you talk about?
It was a podcast I used to do. I don't do it anymore. With a girl by the name of Krista Risa, and we had a lot of fun with that. But yeah, I actually started. I had written a book years ago. I'd written a book on Gettysburg. And it's Ghost Soldiers of Gettysburg, and I'd done like 7 years of research up in Gettysburg on the paranormal activity that occurs there. When people go and visit, they always have these strange experiences. So I have a background in the paranormal, and also our production company that I have, we've done UFO documentaries. So we've also we've taken deep dives into the whole UFO phenomenon. So we would talk about anything, and anything paranormal, out of the ordinary, that just to chat about it, and that was a lot of fun. We always used to talk about really cool things. I love the paranormal phenomena, and an attempt to understand it better, right? Like what is this? And I've always loved the idea of hauntings and what they are, because I've had a couple experiences myself over the years, and once that happens to you, you're like, well, wait a minute, I need to know more about this. So you kind of get hooked on it. So it was a cool show, and we might go back to it. We had a lot of fun doing it, but we'll see. But yeah, I love that stuff, and I have researched those things in the past.
What is your theory about UFOs? I often ask people this who are interested in UFOs, because it seems more and more there's a real division between the nuts and bolts spaceships from other planets people and the transdimensional, interdimensional, so we say John Killian people. Do you have a position? Do you find yourself on one side of that or the other? Or I'm not sure. I always ask people these questions.
I tend to go back and forth. The idea of interdimensional beings could make a little more sense from the standpoint of that's what allows them to phase in and out here, right?
Right.
So if you see something and then it's gone, I mean, some people say Bigfoot could be interdimensional. It would explain why there's never a body, right? They just come, they phase in, they phase out, and people see them briefly, and then they're gone. And that's could the same thing with ghosts, right? It's a higher dimension, and the soul is at a higher dimension. So that could be, we're seeing spirit, right, in that higher dimension. But I also believe that our science can't explain right now, at least, how a race can get from there to here, right? If they're several light years away, and then how do they do it? Well, quantum physics, now there's theories out there that, well, you can bend space, you can travel in different ways, and then that whole idea of warp speed and wormholes, right? And how do they get from here to there? But there is something to be said for that interdimensional kind of travel. And maybe they're interdimensional, higher dimensional beings, But the one thing for sure is that they exist. I'm not sure what they are or who they are, but it tends to point to the fact that, there's too many people who I saw, now it could have been military, but I saw a triangular shaped craft.
Oh.
And it was very stealth. You couldn't hear it. And it had 3 lights on each of the angles, the triangles, the 3 points of the triangle. And but I'm like, well, that could be military, but it could be reverse engineered technology from crashed UFOs, that whole thing, because people, certainly in the 1940s and 50s, we did not have that technology. So whatever people were seeing, that wasn't ours, and it wasn't the Russians. It was definitely either interplanetary or interdimensional.
Yeah, that makes some sense to me. I've always found the whole idea of what aliens look like is a bit strange. If I never read this after in John Keel, but it occurred to me as well that, you know, they always seem to be of a certain kind of size and shape. So that wherever they're from, the gravity has to be fairly similar. Most often they have no kind of breathing apparatus, so they must breathe the same air as we do. They don't have all over coverings off, and then their faces are exposed, so they must have the same germs and viruses that we have, because they're also immune to those as well. It sounds more like they're from another version of here rather than some alien planet that's completely different. There was something I thought years ago, and a lot of this interdimensional stuff is talking about that kind of idea that it's alternate versions of here that they somehow managed to sort of skip across and then back again. As you said, the Bigfoot is a good example. But I didn't know a lot about Bigfoot until fairly recently, and I've got chat a lot with people about the Bigfoot idea that they are transdimensional, interdimensional, because that's a very good point. There's so much evidence this thing seems to be out there, yet no one's ever found a body. You know, where are they all going when they die? You know, what's happening to them? And if they are something that, to us and our way of understanding life and intelligence, that they would look unintelligent. They're just sort of big, hairy animals. But maybe that's the thing, that their way of being intelligent is so totally different to us, that although they physically are like us, because they live in the same gravity and atmosphere, but they think totally differently. It's like we know from research that dolphins are very, very intelligent. But you look at dolphins swimming around, you wouldn't think that from watching it swimming around. It's only because we know from experimentation that they are very intelligent. Therefore, the Bigfoot could be intelligent in a very different way that to us looks like some kind of sort of grunts and noises. But yeah, at the same time, perhaps there's a way of communicating that we don't understand. I mean, have you ever heard the Ron Moorhead recordings that he made in the 70s of the Bigfoots that came to his camp, and the almost like speech-like voices that they recorded? They're quite amazing. I've often listened to those and thinking that he literally does sound like some kind of communication going on between these creatures. It's incredible. So I'm working on a kind of a unified theory of that and ghosts, that they're essentially the same thing. It depends on, and our audience are going to say, here he goes again, because I talk about this every bloody time, but the idea that they are universality of these weird phenomena is essentially it's the same thing appearing differently depending on your interests and what you've experienced. So that's always been my own thinking. I know we talked before about the Cold War and UFO activity. I wonder if you want to perhaps talk about that at all. As it kind of
absolutely.
What we've been talking about with the JFK, of course, being in the middle of the Cold War period, and a lot of strange stuff was seen during those times.
You know, this is another. It's just another cover up, really, is what it is, right? So, from the standpoint of so World War II ends, and the modern era of UFO sightings begins. And it's, you know, we drop the bomb, and all of a sudden it seems like we got their interest. You know, we piqued their interest, like, hey, what are you guys doing? So all of a sudden, you know, 1947, Roswell crash, all these things, tons of UFO reports. And I think at the time where you have the Cold War happening at the same time, a lot of it was, is it the Russians? And the Russians were, is it us? What kind of technology is this? Because that was the thing that scared. That was the highest level of national security. Was if they have this technology, we're in trouble. And it went both ways, right? So I think what started happening is these craft would be in the United States. There were a lot of these craft, and again, they were saucer shaped, right? You had these different kinds of shaped objects that would appear, and hence flying saucer. And they would fly over military bases with that had nuclear missile installations, and a lot of times they would disable the nuclear missiles, which I think was a message. And I've interviewed ex-military guys who were, one guy was in Miami, one was in Key West. I actually wrote a book about it called Unknown Down, where they were at a nuclear missile base, and these craft came down, and they came down from the Antarctic, and they were following them on radar, and they were flying at extremely high speed. So they knew it wasn't us, and we kind of knew that there's no way it could be the Soviets either, you know. And this was happening all over the place at these missile bases. So that was a major national security threat. And at some point, Did we make contact? I don't know. Some people said the Eisenhower administration made contact, and every president since has kind of been like, I want to know, right? You know, you hear the stories about Kennedy wanting to know, Nixon definitely wanting to know, Carter definitely wanting to know, Clinton definitely wanting to know. These people wanted to know what was going on. I think George Bush Sr. already knew because he was the director of the CIA, so he had more insight than most. But again, these are very dark projects. This is above top secret. This is above black stuff, and it's a need to know. And again, I think that presidents think they have all this. You know, they do. They have an enormous amount of power, but they don't have the ultimate power. Yeah. There are people in dark rooms and dark hallways, underground facilities, you know, who have this really, you know, they really have the power. And I think that, you know, it's when you had the Cold War occurring, and that's what worried people too, because if a UFO crashed in the Soviet Union, would they be able to back engineer the technology? And that was the same concern for the Soviet Union, was could the United States back engineer the technology? And I think the answer was yes in both cases. Now, you know, with the United Kingdom, they had their own. You guys have had many of your own UFO stories and incidents, without question. I don't know. I don't know if I've ever heard of any crashes. I don't know. You would know about that. But again, you're one of the most powerful nations in the world too, and you know, and our allies certainly during the Cold War, most certainly. And so it's like, well, what do we do about this? And, you know, we're seeing these things as well. So any country that had nuclear capabilities, and they're seeing these objects fly around and being able to disable the nuclear missiles, you know, very easily. Yeah. It's scary. So you had all this stuff going on, and there's no question, like, I know that they have like these transitions of power between Truman and Eisenhower, and then Eisenhower and Kennedy, where, you know, they ask each other, it's like, well, you know, what do you know? What can we know? What are we allowed to know? You know, and I know a lot of presidents just want to dig deeper and know more, but they're not, you know, they don't, the people who do know don't care if you're the president.
No, I mean, you always know at the most there for 8 years and then they're gone. These people are career people. They are career military. Right. They're for their whole life. So they see several presidents and different parties in power. So why would they give the information to someone who's going to be gone in at most 8 years, maybe 4?
Right. And then there's they're civilians after that.
Exactly. I've always wondered, you mentioned it again, I think you're right about the atomic explosions, whether that caused interdimensional ripple of some kind, and they notice, what the hell's going on here? This ripple, it's cracked, it's cause and effect. We need to get across to them and stop them going any further. Because that's, of course, the question would be, parallel realities, one might be running faster than the other one. They could be ahead of us, you know, by centuries. If you got 1 millisecond quicker over 1 million years, that's a long time ahead. You know, it only takes that little amount of time per minute, 1 millisecond faster, and then you accumulate that over 1 million years. And these other dimensions could be millions of years ahead of us, so they could easily flip and say, "Oh no, we don't have any idea what they're doing. They're doing it the wrong way. We need to stop them." We'll come through the interdimensional rifts of their own that they can open up, sit over these nuclear weapons, and turn them off so they don't work. So let's get to my little thinking on that idea. But that was always been fascinating, that it has been around that time. I mean, I know some people would say, well, it's all Cold War stuff. They're all worried about each other. And then all the reports of UFOs, they're just stealth craft and that kind of thing. And there's a general sense of suspicion of the other side. And that probably plays a part in it. But yeah, I mean, the sudden acceleration of sightings from the late 40s onwards suggests something changed. There was something different going on, whether people were more observant, or it was just the fact that there was more things happening because of atomic explosions, that did cause some kind of strange sort of ripple or change in the sort of the environment.
That is a great point. And those nuclear explosions could very well cause an issue interdimensionally. I like to think that they're also interplanetary, because if you think they go in a way, they intersect. It could go hand in hand. They could be interdimensional, but also interplanetary. So what I mean by that is in a different or an alternate, you talk about alternate universes. So it could be if you could be on a planet that is, I always look at, we had a couple of really interesting cases in one of the first documentaries we made with hybrid children showing up. So you have this idea of people being abducted, and then all of a sudden, and you know, and during those abductions, they're experimented on, right? They take fluids out of their body. They take, you know, women, you know, their reproductive organs are messed with, right? And then they get pregnant. There's these unknown pregnancies. No idea how they got pregnant, and then they're not pregnant, and they get abducted again, and then they're not pregnant, and then and then boom, all of a sudden they get abducted again. They're meeting their hybrid children. This happens. Happens in this all over the world, and that's a very strange phenomenon. There's no question about it. But and we had this situation where these little girls were showing up around this guy who was apparently their human father, and they were hybrid children. He had been abducted several times, and they would be there, and then they wouldn't be there. So they would show up, they would hand them a flower, and then the next thing you know, they'd walk away, but then they'd be gone. Where'd they go? Right? And they're little girls, so it's not like they're not getting in a car and driving away. You know, and there's this idea of the ability to phase in and out dimensionally.
Yeah.
That is, and again, do I understand that science? I absolutely do not understand that science. I couldn't begin to tell you about that. But there is, just as a theory, right? You think about, and again, objective thinking. Think about it objectively. A little girl that looks very strange, looks like a hybrid, is here on Earth, in you know, in front of you, at a conference or in a parking lot, and then the next thing you know, they're gone. They're not there anymore. Right? They're there, and then all of a sudden, where'd they go? Well, where'd they go?
Yeah.
You know, and then so you're like, well, maybe they can phase in and out dimensionally, just like the craft do.
Yeah. That's again, that's kind of my thinking on those sorts of lines. I looked a lot of old folklore. I've written a book on sort of folklore and magic in the UK, and the number of stories of things coming from underground, coming out of hills, you know, small, what they call elves and fairy folk, that kind of thing. That to me, it's a kind of continuation, that same sort of thing of they're visible, they're there for me, and then they disappear. Sort of olden times, if you like, they would describe them as going into the hills, going into sort of burial mounds, that kind of thing. But they just vanished effectively. That was the point. They just disappeared, and trying to add a kind of an explanation where they went underground, and that was the idea. These things came from beneath the earth, whereas now they come from in the sky or appear out of nowhere, completely out of the blue. So I think these sort of phasing creatures, if you like, they go on for centuries. And not just that part is not just modern times. It's gone on for hundreds of years. As my little collection of folklore books go back to the early 1800s, and they've recorded these kinds of stories. So there's definitely been this phenomenon, been around for a very long time, of these beings appearing and disappearing. And again, they do talk about the idea of sort of being sided by a fairy, almost like a changeling. The child's been replaced by a fairy child. So that kind of fits that same kind of theme as well, this idea of these not fully human beings being raised as if they're human or being brought into the family and then disappearing. Like the child gets swapped with a fairy child, the parent brings the child up for a while, then the fairy child is taken away and the kid's gone completely. These kind of stories are told. Now, again, how true they are when you talk about sort of folklore from the 200 years ago, who knows, you know, how accurate they actually are. But you get the sense they're trying to explain things in ways they understood at the time, how they experienced these sorts of things. So those kind of disappearancing phenomena is not uncommon in sort of old folklore stories. I mean, these actual first-hand folklore accounts, the actual written accounts that folklorists took from people, not just stories passed on father to son, etc. Their first-hand experiences these sort of local yokels were having. So again, that kind of fits in that sort of theme of children kind of appearing and disappearing.
I totally, yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, what if they're just higher vibrational beings? You know, and again, that would explain it all. And the fact that you bring up fairies and things like that is very interesting, because many people believe there's, you know, the mystery schools, the ancient mystery schools, right? I mean, we talk about that going back thousands and thousands of years. This ancient knowledge the secret knowledge of people who, some people say that Jesus, in the quote unquote lost years of Jesus, he was going around all these mystery schools and learning stuff. And there's a lot of having that knowledge is something that makes you, we look at people like Jesus and, and to lesser extents, Leonardo da Vinci, and like, God, these guys were amazing. They were ahead of their time, right? But they may have had this ancient knowledge. It goes back to the Knights Templar. I mean, it's a fascinating thing.
Oh, yeah.
But when you think about that ancient, a lot of people, I don't know if people realize this, but J.R.R. Tolkien, who obviously Lord of the Rings, wrote Lord of the Rings, he was a high-level mystery school initiate.
Oh, very much so. Very much so.
And part of that understanding and knowledge is the fact that you have creatures such as fairies. You can put Bigfoot in there. These higher vibrational beings are higher vibrational, so they're one dimension up from us, right? So there's levels, there's different dimensional levels, and that many believe that fairies and elves are in this category, were earthbound, and at some point, and that they just got tired of humanity and human beings, and then decided to go to they were capable of going to a higher dimensional plane of existence.
Mm-hmm.
And when you watch Lord of the Rings, what happens with the elves?
Absolutely, yes. Off to the far shores.
Exactly, that blew my mind when I found that out, that J.R.R. Tolkien was a high-level mystery school initiate. I'm like, wow, what did he know? And it's all at Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's like, yeah, there are the elves and they're leaving.
Yeah, exactly. It's the Inklings group, as they were called. It was him. C.S. Lewis was a member as well, and there was other lesser-known writers, but they all were very much interested in all the mystery schools. Absolutely, you can see it in the writings, as you say. It's there. It's not immediately obvious, but the themes thematically are definitely present in those writings.
Yep. Right.
Definitely.
That's fascinating. I love it.
Yeah, same here. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know many people have actually read the whole of Lord of the Rings, the book itself. I must admit, I have. It took a long time, but I have read the whole thing.
I had to read that in high school, believe it or not.
Good Lord.
So, and I had to read The Hobbit too. The Hobbit was much easier because it was one book.
Fun.
But the Lord of the Rings was quite a thing to read. But listen, it was amazing writing. I mean, the fact that this guy created this entire world in his head.
Absolutely, yeah. And it was the whole idea of giving the British Isles a mythology that it lacked. That was the idea, because then it's kind of thematically a little bit like Nibelungenlied, the German mythology, and he kind of tailored it into the English version. That was always the idea. And I just as you say, the detail. I mean, you can go on for hours about Tolkien. I love Tolkien stuff, but the detail, the structure, the frames is incredible. The whole language and the constructed languages that are proper, complete languages. It's amazing. But we're going completely off track.
That's okay. It's fun stuff, right? I mean, it's
absolutely,
all yeah.
Well, I think perhaps we'll begin to wrap things up. Then we've had a good hour or so, an hour and a half actually, I think. In total, it's been an excellent conversation we've been having about something that we both really are very interested in, but certainly Jack's book is available now. It's called Killing Kennedy, Exposing the Plot, the Cover-Up and the Consequences, and it's available from Amazon. I think I've seen it on Amazon. Where else can people get it from?
Amazon, or if people want, they can go directly to my website, which is jackrothauthor.com.
Absolutely.
And they can go there, and then they can click on Amazon or whoever else might be, carrying the book. So yeah, but Amazon's really the best way to find it.
Excellent. As I say, I haven't got it yet, but I definitely will be. I've got quite a library of books on the JFK assassination. I've got a shelf full, which I've read through most of them, because it is one of those topics that I find myself coming back to time and time again. And it's been kind of funny for me doing this, because I've been interviewed by other shows about JFK assassination a few times. So I'm like trying to sit back and shut up, let you do the talking.
No, listen, I love conversations, and it should be a conversation, right? I mean, I don't know. I feel like I'm a documentarian. I'm a journalist, really, and I'm just interviewing people and learning as anyone would learn about this. And I in the book, again, I don't give any definitive answers, but what I do give is really compelling insight based on the interviews with the people I interviewed. And I think that's the strength of it. And that's how you really, that's why I think I've gotten some really good feedback so far. And I think the reason for that is it's very compelling reading. It's easy to read. It's easy to get through. And it's just really interesting because of the questions I ask and the emotional elements of the interviews themselves. As I think they're really powerful, and it shows why it still matters. In the end, that's why it still matters. It matters because it's still affecting us.
Yeah.
And we can't be whole again as a nation until the truth comes out, and therefore, I don't know if we'll ever be whole as a nation again.
And of course, speaking as a non-American, it affects us, particularly the UK, because we have such a close relationship with America. But, that whole idea that you see yourselves, I always read about this idea as being the leader of the free world, but, in a sense you are, you've got the biggest military of the free world, so we're the guys we turn to. So to know there's a little bit of a darkness at the center there is always a bit disconcerting, a bit worrying. So, it matters to us as well that this still hasn't been, well, I'd say not been solved. I think it's been solved, but there's no one prepared to accept it's been solved. And the evidence there, it's like another thing I'm fascinated with is Jack the Ripper. If you look at all the evidence and information about Jack the Ripper, you can piece together who it was. It was a single guy on his own. It was a psychopath killer living in the East End of London. There's no doubt about it. Most serious Jack the Ripper researchers will tell you that it's Kosminski or someone like Kosminski, but there's still all these books out there about royal conspiracies and this conspiracy and that conspiracy because they don't want it solved, because it's a story that people want to keep going. It doesn't really matter. 5 people were killed, of course that matters, but it doesn't affect us day to day. JFK is completely different. It affects us even today, definitely.
Correct. Yep.
And on that note, I think we'll leave it there.
Very well put, Andy. That was excellent.
It was excellent, Jack. Hopefully we'll have you back again another time, because I'm still sure there's more we can definitely talk about. We only really skimmed through the UFO stuff, and I think that would be another show that would be very interesting to have a conversation about at some point in the future.
That would be great. I'd love to chat with you again.
Excellent. And hopefully next time my co-host Kerry will be able to talk to us as well, because as I mentioned at the beginning, Kerry, my usual co-host, has got a terrible cold, and I've had a tooth pulled out of my head today, so my mouth is a bit weird, so I'm talking a bit strange. So it's been a bit of an odd show, but been an excellent show. And this will be our November show, and we'll be back next month in December, and we'll be talking about Christmas mysteries with a guest. But that's all for now. This is me, Andy Mercer, signing off from the Paranormal UK radio show. Bye for now.